The grand ballroom of the Starlight Charity Gala pulsed with the kind of opulence that made even the wealthiest guests straighten their posture. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, scattering light across marble floors polished to a mirror's edge. The air was thick with the scent of imported orchids, vintage champagne, and the unspoken competition of New York's elite. In the center of it all stood Matthew Carter, tall, tailored, and utterly in his element. His navy tuxedo fit him like a second skin, his hair swept back with precision, his smile calculated for maximum charm. On his arm was Cassandra Hale, a 25-year-old social media influencer with 1 million followers and a dress made entirely of shimmering silver sequins. Every turn of her body caught the camera flashes, and she leaned into them like a woman born for the spotlight. Matthew laughed loudly at something one of his investors said, his hand resting possessively on Cassandra's waist. He looked like a man who had won the perfect career, the perfect girlfriend, the perfect image. And tonight he was here to cement it all by announcing a high-profile business partnership. Photographers swarmed, snapping pictures that would be on society blogs by morning. "Matthew, over here. Smile for page 6, one called out. Cassandra obliged, tossing her hair so the diamonds at her ears glittered under the chandeliers. Matthew's smile widened. He was enjoying himself far too much to notice the subtle shift in the room's energy. It began at the far end of the ballroom. A low murmur, the kind of reaction that moved through a crowd like the first ripple on still water. Heads turned toward the entrance, voices dropping to hushed whispers. The photographers stopped shouting Matthew's name. Even the string quartet seemed to falter for a beat. And then she appeared. Olivia Carter. Her presence sliced through the room's carefully curated artifice like a blade through silk. She was 6 months pregnant, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly as she moved forward with unhurried grace. Her gown was a deep emerald silk that clung in all the right places, the kind of dress that didn't just flatter, it declared. The train whispered against the marble as she walked, the subtle shimmer of the fabric catching the light with every step. Her hair, once worn in a simple bun the way Matthew liked, now fell in glossy waves around her shoulders. Her makeup was flawless. Not heavy, just enough to accentuate the glow in her cheeks and the fierce determination in her eyes. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she was going and exactly who she was. Gasps escaped lips. "Is that?" someone whispered. "Olivia Carter? I thought they divorced months ago." Another voice. "She's pregnant? With his child?" Matthew turned at last, alerted by the sudden hush. For a split second, he didn't recognize her. This wasn't the pale, exhausted woman he'd left behind half a year ago. This was someone entirely new. His smile faltered, confusion flashing across his face before he quickly masked it with a tight smirk. Cassandra, sensing the shift in attention, stiffened. "Who's that?" she asked under her breath. "My ex-wife," Matthew muttered, his jaw tightening. "She's changed." But the room wasn't done changing. A photographer, recognizing Olivia, raised his camera. "Olivia, over here!" The flash went off, then another, and suddenly the dam broke. The sound of shutters firing filled the air as she continued walking, each step a challenge, each click of her heels a reminder that she was no ghost from Matthew's past. She was very much alive in his present. And then the whispers took on a sharper edge. "That's her." A woman in a diamond choker murmured to her companion. "The one from the jet photos." Matthew's head snapped toward the direction of the voice. "What?" "The billionaire's jet," the man replied, his tone both amused and impressed. "Photos went viral last week. Olivia Carter, pregnant, laughing with Ethan Blackwell." Ethan Blackwell. The name alone was enough to make Matthew's stomach twist. Blackwell was a reclusive, notoriously private billionaire with more influence in their industry than Matthew could dream of. The idea that Olivia had not only crossed paths with him, but been photographed looking radiant and intimate by his side, was a blow Matthew hadn't prepared for. Cassandra's eyes narrowed. "She's using you for attention." Matthew didn't answer. His gaze was locked on Olivia as she stopped at the foot of the stage, her chin lifted, her posture impeccable. The master of ceremonies, clearly flustered, hurried over to greet her. And instead of escorting her out as Matthew might have hoped, he bowed slightly, offering her his arm. "Mrs. Carter." He caught himself, glancing at her hand where a wedding ring no longer sat. Miss Carter, what an honor to have you join us." Olivia smiled politely, but her eyes never left Matthew's, the kind of look that didn't need words to say. "You thought you buried me. You thought wrong." The cameras flashed again, brighter, faster. The investors who had been hanging on Matthew's every word minutes earlier were now leaning toward one another, whispering about the new power player in the room. And for the first time all night, Matthew felt a crack in the perfect image he had built for himself. Because the truth was undeniable. Olivia hadn't lost her glow. She'd taken it back. And she'd made sure the entire city was here to see it. 6 months before that electric night at the Starlight Gala, Olivia Carter's world looked very different. At 32, she was the kind of woman people described as steady. Not because she lacked ambition, but because she had built her life around loyalty. A small-town girl from Willow Creek, she'd grown up in a house that smelled of fresh-baked bread and wood polish, with a mother who ran the local flower shop and a father who fixed everything from tractors to kitchen sinks. Her childhood had been modest, full of laughter, Friday night football games, and the belief that love, once found, could weather anything. Olivia met Matthew Carter her sophomore year at NYU. He was tall, confident, and carried the kind of city polish she'd only seen in movies. He studied finance, she studied interior design. They met at a campus fundraiser. She was arranging flowers for the event. He was pouring champagne for donors. He struck up a conversation about how she'd chosen the blooms, and she teased him for misidentifying a peony as a rose. He laughed, she smiled, and by the end of the night, he'd asked her out. Back then, Matthew had been charming in a way that felt genuine. He walked her to the subway, brought her coffee before exams, and once skipped a networking event just to watch the first snowfall of the season with her from the Brooklyn Bridge. They married 4 years later, in a ceremony that mixed her small-town warmth with his Manhattan sophistication. Wildflowers in crystal vases, a jazz quartet playing beneath strings of Edison bulbs. Olivia put her interior design ambitions on hold after their wedding. At first, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. She told herself she'd go back to it once Matthew's career stabilized. In the meantime, she built their home into a place that felt like a sanctuary. Soft colors, warm lighting, and the smell of something baking in the oven when he came through the door. She kept track of birthdays for his clients, made sure their holiday cards went out on time, hosted dinner parties where she floated through the room refilling glasses and making everyone feel welcome. When she learned she was pregnant, it felt like the missing piece of their puzzle had finally clicked into place. She'd found out on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the city felt wrapped in a silver mist. Matthew was in the middle of a conference call when she told him. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "We'll make it work, Liv." But as her pregnancy progressed, Matthew seemed to retreat into himself. There were more late nights at the office, more urgent business trips. When he was home, his eyes were often glued to his phone. She told herself it was just stress. After all, his company had just landed a big contract. Still, little cracks began to show. One evening, about 3 months in, Olivia came into the living room to find Matthew staring at her from across the room. Not with the adoration she used to see, but with something else, something she couldn't quite place. "You've changed," he said slowly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. She laughed softly, thinking he meant her growing belly. "Of course I've changed. I'm carrying your child." He didn't smile. "You've lost your glow, Liv. I mean, look at you. You used to light up a room. Now," he gestured vaguely, as if her entire being could be summed up in a wave of his hand. The words hit her harder than she expected. She told herself it was the hormones, but deep down, something shifted that night. She began to notice the way he lingered on social media photos of women they knew, perfectly styled, perfectly toned, perfectly everything she wasn't at the moment. Still, she tried to keep the peace. She cooked his favorite meals even when the smell of them made her nauseous. She asked about his day even when he barely looked up from his phone to answer. She bought new dresses, dabbed on perfume before he came home, hoping to recapture whatever magic he thought she'd lost. But the distance only grew. It wasn't until later, far too late, that she realized Matthew had been laying the groundwork for his escape. Invitations to events stopped arriving in both their names. He began traveling with colleagues she'd never heard of before. And when he did speak to her, it was often in clipped sentences, as though she were an employee who'd failed to meet a deadline. The final blow came one chilly afternoon in November. She was sorting through the mail when she found an invitation to the Starlight Charity Gala, the same gala where they'd been regulars for the past 5 years. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Matthew Carter and guest. Her name wasn't mentioned anywhere. When she asked him about it, he shrugged. "It's probably just a printing error. Don't read into it." But Olivia knew better. That night, as she lay awake in bed, listening to the city hum outside their window, she thought about the girl she'd been when she met him. Confident, creative, full of dreams. She realized she'd been living small, folding herself into the shape he wanted, until she barely recognized her own reflection. And she decided something quietly, almost without realizing it. She wasn't going to keep shrinking. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know when. But there would come a day when Matthew Carter would see her again. And he wouldn't just see the woman he'd dismissed. He'd see the woman he could never have again. The Starlight Charity Gala was not just another event on the city's social calendar. It was the event. Invitations were whispered about months in advance, printed on heavy cream cardstock and delivered by hand to ensure their arrival carried weight. Attendance was a declaration of status. You were either someone who could make things happen, or someone desperate to be near those who could. The Crystal Renaissance Hotel had been preparing for weeks. The ballroom, already one of the most opulent in New York, was transformed into something out of a dream, or a movie set designed to make you feel underdressed no matter what you wore. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, while crystal chandeliers dripped light onto round tables dressed in ivory linen and crowned with towering arrangements of white orchids and blush roses. At the far end, a raised stage awaited the evening speakers. To the right, a silent auction displayed items so rare they looked more at home in a museum. A signed first edition of The Great Gatsby, a pair of courtside Knicks tickets, a weekend at a private island resort. To the left, the open bar sparkled with bottles of vintage champagne and jewel-toned liqueurs, manned by bartenders in crisp white jackets. This was the arena Matthew Carter had been dreaming of all year. He'd told everyone who would listen that this gala would be the night he solidified his position among the city's power players. His company had been working on a lucrative investment deal with one of Hartwell Global's subsidiaries, the kind of deal that could triple his net worth in a matter of months. Tonight, he planned to announce it publicly, sealing his reputation as a rising star in finance. Of course, he hadn't mentioned that his guest for the evening was not his wife. Cassandra Hale arrived with him, shimmering in a gown that clung to her like liquid silver. Her every step was accompanied by the faint click of her diamond-encrusted heels against the marble, the kind of sound designed to turn heads. Matthew made sure to walk slowly, giving photographers enough time to capture their entrance from every angle. He was at ease here, shaking hands with investors, clapping shoulders, laughing a touch too loudly at the jokes of men whose approval he wanted. Cassandra stayed close, offering the occasional dazzling smile, but mostly reveling in the attention her beauty drew. She didn't know or care about the charity's mission. This was about being seen, and she was very, very good at it. The other guests noticed her immediately. Whispers trailed in their wake, a mix of curiosity and judgment. "That's not Olivia, is it?" one woman murmured to her husband. "When did he?" Her question trailed off into a knowing glance. In these circles, gossip was currency, and Matthew had just made a very public deposit. Meanwhile, the orchestra played a gentle waltz, the music floating through the air like a layer of perfume. Waiters glided between the tables with trays of canapés, miniature lobster rolls, truffle arancini, smoked salmon roses perched on cucumber rounds. Champagne flutes caught the light like prisms. From the outside, it was perfect. But perfection here was always an illusion. Beneath the polite smiles and carefully chosen words lay a battlefield of unspoken rivalries and subtle power plays. One wrong move, a poorly timed comment, an ill-advised companion, could shift your standing in ways that took years to repair. That was why Matthew's decision to bring Cassandra was bold or reckless. He had gone to great lengths to ensure Olivia's name was absent from the guest list. He'd even called in a favor with the event's planning committee, claiming that she had stepped away from public life and preferred privacy during her pregnancy. In truth, he wanted her invisible. Out of sight, out of mind. He wanted the night and the narrative to belong entirely to him. What he didn't know was that Olivia had never been out of the loop. Her family's connection to Hartwell Global was not something she flaunted, but the influence it granted her ran deep. The Hartwell name opened doors Matthew didn't even know existed, and one of those doors led straight to the organizing board of the Starlight Gala. When Olivia called the chairwoman 2 weeks earlier, she didn't ask for permission to attend. She simply informed her she would be there, and that she'd be making a modest contribution. The kind of modest contribution that paid for the orchids now cascading down the center of every table. Still, on the evening of the gala, Matthew believed he had the upper hand. He moved through the ballroom with Cassandra as though they were royalty, greeting other guests with the confidence of a man whose star was on the rise. Every handshake was an investment, every laugh another brick in the fortress of his new image. He didn't notice the subtle shift in the air when certain guests glanced toward the entrance. He didn't see the discreet nods exchanged between board members. He was too busy telling an anecdote about his upcoming deal, carefully leaving out the fact that the ink wasn't dry. The night followed its well-rehearsed script. Guests mingled, the orchestra swelled, and at precisely 8:30, the master of ceremonies took the stage to welcome everyone. Cameras clicked as Matthew and Cassandra positioned themselves near the front, ready for the announcement he'd been building toward all year. It was all going according to plan. Until it wasn't. Because in less than 15 minutes, the woman he thought he'd erased from the picture would walk through those grand double doors, and the perfect stage he'd set for himself would become the backdrop for his undoing. The setting was ready. The players were in place. And somewhere just outside the ballroom, Olivia Carter was preparing to change the story and the power dynamic forever. Matthew Carter had mastered the art of looking like the good guy. He knew exactly when to shake a hand, when to laugh, and when to lower his voice as if confiding in someone who mattered. He'd built his career not just on numbers and deals, but on image, an image polished until it gleamed. In photos, he was always in control. Jaw set just so, tie perfectly knotted, eyes holding a glimmer that suggested he knew something you didn't. To his colleagues, Matthew was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back, but only if he could make sure a photographer was there to capture the moment. He sat on the boards of 2 charities, not because the causes touched his heart, but because the galas brought him into rooms with people whose signatures could change his financial future. Every donation he made was a calculated move. Every appearance, a step in the chess game of his social climb. What he despised most, though he would never say it aloud, was being invisible. It was part of what had drawn him to Cassandra Hale. She was younger, louder, more camera-friendly than Olivia. Where Olivia's beauty was understated, Cassandra's was engineered for attention. Spray-tanned skin, sculpted cheekbones, a wardrobe designed to be photographed. She didn't just walk into a room. She announced herself with the staccato click of stiletto heels and a laugh that could slice through the noise of any crowd. Matthew liked that. She was a distraction, a way to signal to the world that he'd moved on to something more glamorous. Of course, Cassandra didn't come without her own ambitions. She'd grown her online following from scratch, turning sponsored posts and brand deals into a 6-figure income. But more than money, she craved relevance. The kind that only proximity to power could give. Matthew was her ticket into the upper echelons of the city's elite, and she played the part of the doting partner with an actress's precision. Together, they made a striking pair. But beneath the surface, their relationship was built on mutual exploitation. Matthew provided her with status, and she provided him with a living, breathing billboard that screamed, "I'm winning." And in Matthew's mind, winning often meant rewriting history. That was why he'd gone to such lengths to erase Olivia from this gala. He'd spun a careful story for anyone who asked, painting himself as a man who'd been forced to endure a difficult end to his marriage. He suggested, without outright saying, that Olivia couldn't handle the pressures of his career, that she'd wanted a smaller life, while he was destined for something bigger. In truth, what Matthew couldn't handle was Olivia's quiet strength. She never needed the spotlight, but she could command a room with a single glance. She had opinions that cut through the nonsense, and she didn't worship his every move. At first, he'd found that challenging in an attractive way. But over time, as his ego grew, he began to see her independence as a threat. So he did what men like Matthew often do. He chipped away at her confidence, one casual comment at a time. "You've lost your glow, Liv. You don't get it. This is how business works. You should let me handle things." Each remark was delivered with a smile, just enough charm to make it sound like advice rather than criticism. By the time they separated, Matthew had convinced himself he was the hero of the story. The man who'd tried to save his marriage until it became clear that they wanted different things. The truth was uglier. He'd already been seeing Cassandra before the paperwork was filed. He'd already imagined walking into a place like the Starlight Gala with a woman who would draw every eye in the room. And he'd already decided that Olivia, pregnant, private, unwilling to play the part of arm candy, didn't fit the narrative he was writing for himself. At the gala, Matthew leaned into that narrative hard. He moved through the crowd with Cassandra on his arm, introducing her as if she'd always belonged there. "Cassandra Hale," he'd say, his voice warm and authoritative, "has been such a support to me this year. I'm lucky to have her here tonight." He used words like support and partner deliberately, words designed to suggest that what he had with Cassandra was not only legitimate, but superior to what he'd had before. And yet, for all his control, there was one thing Matthew didn't know. He didn't know that the very company he was about to announce a partnership with, Hartwell Global's subsidiary, had been watching him far more closely than he realized. He didn't know that Olivia's family name was tied to the Hartwell brand, or that she had the ear of its most influential board members. He didn't know that in the weeks leading up to the gala, Olivia had been quietly setting her own stage. If he had known, he might have noticed the subtle way some of the investors glanced past him when he spoke, or the polite but cool smiles from people who'd once been eager to shake his hand. He might have seen the faint edge of curiosity in their eyes. Curiosity not about him, but about who else might be showing up tonight. Instead, Matthew saw only what he wanted to see. Himself at the center of the story, admired, envied, untouchable. He didn't hear the whispers starting in the corners of the ballroom. He didn't see the heads turning toward the entrance as the double doors swung open. And he had no idea that in less than a minute, the story he'd so carefully rewritten was about to be torn apart. Not with a scandal, not with a fight, but with a single, undeniable truth. The woman he dismissed as forgettable was about to own the room. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his voice carrying easily over the hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Starlight Charity Gala. Tonight, we celebrate generosity, vision, and the spirit of this great city. And to start, we have a very special announcement." This was Matthew's cue. He gave Cassandra's hand a light squeeze before stepping forward. The crowd parted just enough for him to make his way toward the stage, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Cassandra followed, her silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers, her smile locked in place like a weapon. When they reached the front, Matthew took the mic from the MC with an air of practiced humility. "Thank you," he began, his voice smooth, deep, commanding. "I'm honored to share that Carter Investments will be partnering with Hartwell Global's subsidiary to launch an initiative that will change the landscape of urban development in this city." The audience clapped politely. Matthew's eyes scanned the room, soaking in the sight of investors, board members, and socialites leaning forward to hear more. "And none of this," he continued, "would be possible without the incredible support of my guest tonight." He turned toward Cassandra, drawing her into the spotlight. "Cassandra Hale, everyone, a woman who understands the value of vision and who has been by my side through this remarkable year." There was a smattering of applause. Cassandra gave a demure wave, leaning in just enough to brush her shoulder against Matthew's. Her voice, pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearest table, dripped with mock sympathy. Poor Olivia, probably home in sweatpants, watching this on her phone. The comment landed like a dart in the nearest circle of guests. A few chuckled under their breath. Others exchanged quick, sharp looks, the kind that said, "Did she really just say that?" Matthew smirked, clearly unbothered. "Some people just can't handle this world," he replied. And then the room shifted. It began with a hush, the kind of silence that doesn't feel accidental but deliberate, heavy, charged. Heads turned toward the back of the ballroom. The photographers, who had been half listening to Matthew's speech, suddenly raised their cameras. The grand double doors opened. Olivia stepped inside. For a moment, it felt as if the entire gala had taken a collective breath. She was a vision in deep emerald silk, her gown catching the light with every measured step. The fitted bodice highlighted the graceful curve of her pregnancy, while the sweeping train whispered across the marble floor. Her hair flowed in soft waves, her makeup glowing under the warm light of the chandeliers. But it wasn't just her appearance that froze the room. It was her presence, calm, assured, and utterly unapologetic. She didn't rush, she didn't fidget. She walked as though every person in the ballroom was already aware she belonged there. The first camera flash went off, then another and another. Within seconds, the entrance had turned into a full-blown photo frenzy. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering, "Is that? I thought she wasn't coming. She's pregnant." Cassandra's smile faltered. "What the hell is she doing here?" she hissed under her breath. Matthew's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he muttered, but his eyes never left Olivia. As she moved further into the room, the whispers grew sharper, juicier. "That's her, the one from the photos. The billionaire's jet." It took a split second for Matthew to understand. The images had been everywhere the week before. Olivia Carter, radiant and laughing, sitting beside Ethan Blackwell on the deck of his private jet, sunlight pouring over them as if the universe itself approved. The story had been vague, source close to Blackwell this, rumored new connection that. But the photos had done their work, and now here she was, in his world, on his night. The MC, looking a little panicked, stepped toward her. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "what an honor to have you here this evening. Please, let me escort you to your table." Olivia smiled politely. "Thank you." Her eyes slid to Matthew, holding his for just long enough to make the moment feel like a private conversation in the middle of a public stage. "You wanted me invisible. Now watch me shine." The photographers surged forward, calling her name. "Olivia, over here. Turn this way. Can we get a smile?" She gave them one. Subtle, enigmatic, the kind of smile that makes you wonder what she knows that you don't. Cassandra's nails dug into Matthew's arm. "They're supposed to be taking our picture," she whispered furiously. But the cameras had already decided. Olivia didn't glance at Cassandra. She didn't need to. She was already winning without saying a word. As she passed the front row, a woman at one of the tables murmured just loud enough for several others to hear, "Well, I think we all know who the real star of the night is." Laughter rippled through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. Matthew felt the shift like a crack under his feet. The room wasn't looking at him anymore. They weren't thinking about his deal, his speech, or the woman on his arm. They were watching Olivia, drawn in by something he couldn't control: authenticity. Because for all his carefully crafted image, Matthew's charm was just that, crafted. Olivia in that moment was entirely herself, and it was magnetic. By the time she reached her table, conveniently positioned in full view of the stage, the narrative of the night had changed. No one was talking about Carter Investments' partnership. They were talking about the pregnant ex-wife who just walked in like she owned the place, and maybe, in a way, she did. Matthew tried to continue his speech, but it was pointless. His voice carried over a sea of whispers, none of which were about him anymore. Cassandra's smile had frozen into something brittle, yet her eyes darting toward Olivia, as if trying to figure out how to outshine her, and failing. Olivia simply sat, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a waiter, and turned her attention to the stage. The faintest hint of amusement played at her lips. She didn't need to humiliate Matthew outright. She'd already done it just by showing up. The night of the Starlight Gala ended in a blur for Olivia. She stayed long enough to prove her point. long enough for Matthew to squirm under the weight of her presence, and then she slipped out quietly, letting the whispers follow her into the cool night air. Outside, the city was buzzing, cabs honking, neon signs flickering, the smell of rain lingering in the air. But none of it touched her. She climbed into the back of a black car, gave the driver her address, and stared out the window as the lights of Manhattan smeared into streaks of gold and white. Her phone buzzed constantly in her clutch. Texts from people who had seen her, comments on her sudden reappearance, articles already spinning their own versions of the night. Pregnant Olivia Carter steals the spotlight from ex-husband at gala. Ethan Blackwell's mystery companion makes surprise appearance. She didn't open any of them. By the time she reached her apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only a hollow ache. She stepped out of her heels, letting them clatter to the floor, and padded into the kitchen. The dress still clung to her body, heavy with the scent of perfume and the faint tang of champagne from the gala's air. She poured herself a glass of water, but her hand trembled so much she had to set it down. It was quiet, too quiet. She'd once loved the stillness of her own space, but tonight it pressed against her like a weight. Without the hum of conversation, without the bright lights, the doubts came rushing in. Had she really accomplished anything? Yes, she'd turned heads. Yes, she'd taken some of the power back. But Matthew was still out there, spinning his version of the story. Cassandra was probably already posting filtered photos of the two of them, framing the night as their triumph. And tomorrow the gossip cycle would move on, leaving Olivia alone again, just another woman discarded by a man who never really valued her. She sank onto the couch, resting her hand on her belly. The baby kicked softly, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Not really. But that thought only deepened the ache in her chest. What kind of world was she bringing this child into? One where appearances mattered more than loyalty? Where the truth could be buried under 1,000 photographs and a well-timed smile? The tears came before she could stop them. They weren't the dramatic, shoulder-shaking sobs of a movie scene. They were quieter, heavier, the kind that burned on the way down, the kind that left her feeling drained rather than cleansed. She pressed her face into her hands, letting the mascara smear, not caring that the expensive gown she wore would wrinkle. Hours seemed to pass. At some point, she stood and wandered into the bedroom. The closet door hung open, revealing rows of dresses she hadn't worn in months. Shoes lined up like soldiers, handbags that had once been tokens of Matthew's love, gifts that now felt like props in a play she'd been cast in without her consent. She pulled one of the handbags down from the shelf. Inside was a folded piece of paper, an old note from Matthew. "To my Liv, the most beautiful woman in the room. Always." Her chest tightened. The man who wrote those words had been gone long before he left her. She just hadn't wanted to see it. She dropped the note into the trash. The next morning, the world outside her apartment moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside, Olivia felt suspended between two lives, the one she'd lived with Matthew and the one she didn't know how to start. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. That's when she saw it. A headline in a financial newsfeed, buried beneath the celebrity gossip. Hartwell Global Board restructures ahead of new strategic initiatives. Her eyes narrowed. Her mother's legacy, the company her family had held a quiet but powerful stake in for decades. She hadn't paid much attention to the day-to-day operations since her mother passed, but she still owned a substantial share, enough to get answers if she wanted them. And suddenly she did want them. Because Matthew's big announcement at the gala, the partnership he'd been crowing about, had been with a Hartwell subsidiary. If the board was restructuring, there was a chance that deal wasn't as secure as he'd made it sound. It was a small spark, barely enough to light the dark room she'd been sitting in for months. But it was something. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if sensing the shift in her thoughts. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story after all. Maybe it was the beginning. Still, the road from that spark to action felt impossibly long. She was tired. Not just physically, but in her bones. Her heart still felt bruised, and part of her was terrified that she wasn't strong enough to step into a fight with Matthew, especially one that would play out in the public eye. She stood and walked to the window. Below, the city churned on, indifferent to her struggles. But she'd grown up believing that you didn't have to be the loudest voice in the room to make an impact. You just had to know when to speak and what to say. She would wait. She would plan. And when she was ready, she wouldn't just show up at another gala. She would take the very thing Matthew valued most, his power, and make it her own. For now, though, she let herself sink back into the couch, one hand on her belly, the other curled into a fist against the cushion. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 days after the gala, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, the morning light spilling across a clutter of unopened mail, half-drunk tea, and a bowl of fruit she hadn't touched. She'd been trying to stay off social media, but it was impossible to avoid the ripples her appearance had caused. Every time she opened her phone, there was another headline. Pregnant Olivia Carter radiates at Starlight Gala. Ex-husband's smirk fades as Olivia steals spotlight. Ethan Blackwell's jet photos resurface amid gala drama. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, she felt restless. That restlessness sharpened when her phone buzzed with an email from a name she hadn't seen in years. Richard Donnelly, her late mother's attorney. The subject line was simple. How may it be? Urgent update. Olivia opened it. Miss Carter, I thought you should be aware of developments at Hartwell Global. The board is undergoing a significant restructuring following the retirement of 2 senior members. Given your current stake in the company, 27%, your position is critical in determining the new direction. Please let me know when you're available to discuss next steps. She read it twice, her pulse quickening. 27%. She'd always known she inherited stock from her mother, but she'd never bothered to calculate its exact value. Her mother had handled those matters quietly, treating it more as a safety net than an active asset. Olivia had followed suit. Now the safety net was a lever, and if she pulled it, she could change everything. Her mind jumped to the gala. Matthew's big announcement, his crowning moment, had been tied to a Hartwell subsidiary. He'd practically built his recent reputation on it, and if she remembered correctly, those kinds of deals required final approval from the parent company's board, which meant her. Olivia closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, a slow smile tugging at her lips for the first time in days. This wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity anymore. This was about control. She picked up her phone and called Donnelly. I want to know everything, she said without preamble. Every file, every contract, every name on that board, and I want it today. By that evening, she had a thick folder in her hands. The Hartwell logo, a stylized H in gold, gleamed on the cover. Inside were pages of organizational charts, shareholder lists, and meeting minutes. She spread them across her coffee table like pieces of a puzzle. The more she read, the clearer it became. Matthew's partnership was still in the preliminary stage. It wasn't approved. It wasn't locked in, and without her vote, it never would be. For years, Matthew had told her she didn't understand his world, that she should leave the business side to him. Now she could dismantle that business side with a single signature. She laughed, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound surprised even her. The next morning, she called Ethan Blackwell. They hadn't spoken since the jet photos went viral, but his warm, slightly amused voice came through the line as if no time had passed. Olivia Carter, he said. To what do I owe the pleasure? More tabloid fodder? Not this time, she replied. I need advice. Business or personal? Both, she admitted. Ethan didn't hesitate. Come by the office, noon. Blackwell Tower loomed over Midtown like a steel and glass fortress. Olivia had been there once before, years ago, when Matthew had tagged along to one of Ethan's fundraisers and spent the entire night trying and failing to impress him. This time, she walked in alone. Ethan's office was exactly what she expected. Expansive windows overlooking the city, shelves lined with rare books and artifacts, a desk so sleek it looked carved from shadow. He rose when she entered, crossing the room with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. I hear you caused quite a stir at the gala, he said, motioning for her to sit. I hear you saw the headlines, she countered. They were hard to miss. His smile softened. So, what's this about? Olivia laid the Hartwell folder on his desk. My family's stake, 27%. Matthew's partnership with one of your competitors runs through a Hartwell subsidiary. Without my vote, it doesn't happen. Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning quickly. And you're telling me you're willing to use that leverage? I'm telling you, she said, leaning forward, that I'm done playing small. He tried to erase me. I'm going to make sure he wishes he had never underestimated me. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. You know, in my world, revenge is rarely personal. But in your case, he smiled faintly, I think I can make an exception. They spent the next 2 hours discussing strategy. Ethan knew the players, the timelines, the pressure points. Olivia knew Matthew, his ego, his blind spots, the way he handled setbacks. By the time she left, she had a plan. Step 1, block the deal. Step 2, use her Hartwell influence to make it clear that Matthew's company was too unstable to partner with. Step 3, reintroduce herself to the public, not as a scorned wife, but as a woman of power in her own right. That night, she stood at her window, the city lights stretching out like a promise. She rested her hand on her belly and felt the baby kick, firm, insistent. You're gonna see what your mother's made of, she whispered. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was reacting to Matthew's moves. She was making her own. And she knew exactly where they would lead. The Monday after her meeting with Ethan Blackwell, Olivia stood in front of her full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She'd woken up early, not because she had somewhere to be, but because for the first time in months, she wanted to. The weight of passivity had lifted, replaced by something sharper, more electric. She wasn't the woman sitting in the dark after the gala, replaying Matthew's words in her head. She wasn't the woman quietly enduring advice disguised as criticism. No, she was a woman with a plan, and she needed to look the part. Her first stop was the penthouse salon of Isabelle Fontaine, Manhattan's most sought-after stylist, a woman who charged more for a haircut than some people paid in rent. Isabelle had known Olivia for years, back when she was still Mrs. Carter and preferred understated elegance. When Olivia walked in, Isabelle arched a perfectly shaped brow. Well, she said, this is either about a man or a magazine cover. Which is it? Neither, Olivia replied with a small smile. This is about me. An hour later, her long, soft waves had been cut into a sleek, shoulder-grazing style that framed her face like a declaration. Her hair was darker now, richer, a glossy espresso that made her green eyes seem sharper, more deliberate. Isabelle finished with subtle makeup, a touch of bronze on her cheekbones, and a nude lip that whispered sophistication instead of screaming for attention. Next was her wardrobe. Olivia's old clothes, pastel cardigans, flowing dresses, the kind of pieces Matthew had once described as sweet, no longer felt right. She took them down from their hangers and packed them into donation bags. In their place, she brought in tailored power suits, silk blouses that felt like armor, pencil skirts that moved with precision rather than passivity. She chose colors that made her stand out without begging: emerald, midnight blue, deep burgundy. Her shoes were sharp, her bags structured, every detail intentional. When she stepped out onto Fifth Avenue later that afternoon, heads turned, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she radiated the kind of confidence people instinctively noticed. Her transformation wasn't just about the exterior. Behind the scenes, Olivia had begun attending Hartwell board meetings, first quietly, then with purpose. The other members, many of whom had underestimated her as nothing more than the daughter of a past shareholder, quickly learned that she came prepared. She asked questions no one else asked. She remembered details from reports that others skimmed. She connected dots that made seasoned executives pause. And she didn't stop there. Ethan had introduced her to a network of women in business, CEOs, venture capitalists, philanthropists, who operated on a level Matthew could only dream of. They invited her to lunches in private dining rooms, to strategy retreats in the Hamptons, to charity committees where real influence was traded like currency. Olivia listened more than she spoke at first, but when she did speak, she made it count. She learned how deals were negotiated without ever signing a piece of paper, how alliances were formed over a glass of wine, how reputations could be made or broken with a single well-placed story. Within weeks, her name began appearing in the society pages again, not in the shadow of Matthew's, but alongside some of the most powerful people in the city. Olivia Carter attends Hartwell Women's Leadership Summit. Olivia Carter hosts private fundraiser for arts and education. The accompanying photos showed her poised, polished, and very much in command. She didn't seek Matthew out during this time. She didn't need to. She knew the news would reach him through the same whisper network he'd once used to cut her out. And she knew it would eat at him, slowly, as he realized she wasn't fading quietly into the background. Her pregnancy, which he'd once treated as a weakness, had become part of her strength. She didn't hide it. She styled around it. Maternity dresses in silk and cashmere, perfectly tailored jackets left open to frame her growing belly. When reporters asked about the baby, she smiled and said, "They're arriving at the perfect time." Because they were. Each move she made was deliberate. She positioned herself so that by the time the Hartwell vote on Matthew's deal came up, there would be no question about where her loyalty lay. And it wouldn't be with him. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed in. Nights when she'd sit in her living room, tea cooling in her hands, and think about the girl she'd been at NYU, the one who thought love meant compromise. That girl would have been terrified to make enemies, to play power games. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was a woman who had walked into a room full of people who expected her to be small, and made them look at her instead. She was a woman who had built a new life, while the old one still tried to pretend she didn't exist. And soon, she'd be the woman who ended Matthew Carter's career. Not with a scandal, but with a signature. One crisp Thursday morning, as she prepared for another board meeting, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The sleek hair, the tailored dress, the quiet steel in her eyes, it all told the same story. "I am not who you left behind." The baby kicked, and she smiled. "You and me, kid," she whispered. "We're gonna finish this." The Hartwell Global boardroom was a cathedral of glass and steel, perched 40 floors above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting, while a long, polished table reflected the morning light. On most days, this room was a place of quiet negotiation. Voices low, handshakes firm, egos politely restrained. Today was different. The agenda was clear. The final vote on the Hartwell subsidiary's partnership with Carter Investments, Matthew's deal. He'd been telling anyone who would listen that it was a done deal, that the board loved his proposal, that this was the crown jewel of his career. Olivia sat midway down the table, a folder open in front of her, pen poised as if she were simply taking notes. On the surface, she was the picture of composure. Tailored navy dress, pearl earrings, hair sleek and shining. But inside, her pulse was steady with purpose. Across the table, Matthew adjusted his cufflinks, his confidence radiating. Cassandra wasn't here. This wasn't her world, but he carried himself as though every pair of eyes was already on him. "I think we all know this partnership will be mutually beneficial," he said smoothly. "It's the logical next step for both companies." The chairman nodded toward Olivia. "Miss Carter, as one of our largest shareholders, your position carries significant weight. Do you have any questions before we proceed to the vote?" Olivia closed her folder. "Just one," she said, her voice even. "Has Carter Investments disclosed all current liabilities to the board?" Matthew's smile faltered. "Of course, we've been completely transparent." She slid a document across the table. "Because according to the SEC filings from last quarter, there are 3 pending lawsuits tied to failed development projects in Miami, none of which were mentioned in the proposal." The room went still. "I'm sure those are minor disputes," Matthew said, a hint of strain creeping into his voice. "Minor?" Olivia tilted her head. "2 of them allege fraud, Matthew. The third cites breach of contract with damages exceeding $20 million. That's not minor. That's instability." The board members exchanged glances, murmurs starting down the table. Olivia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I cannot, in good faith, vote to approve a partnership with a company facing that level of unresolved legal and financial risk, and as my 27% stake is required for the majority, my vote is no." The chairman cleared his throat. "Without Miss Carter's support, the motion fails." Matthew's face went pale. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," Olivia said, her gaze steady. "Consider this a lesson in full disclosure. The vote was taken. The motion failed." Just like that, months of Matthew's posturing crumbled into nothing. But Olivia wasn't done. She rose from her seat, gathering her folder. If you'll excuse me, I have another engagement." That other engagement was the Hartwell Spring Benefit, a daytime luncheon at the Plaza Hotel, packed with press, donors, and socialites. The kind of event Matthew would have killed to be photographed at, especially on the heels of a big deal. Olivia arrived in a white, form-fitting dress that framed her pregnancy like a crown jewel rather than a burden. Her entrance was timed perfectly. The photographers were still fresh, the room buzzing with anticipation. "Olivia, over here!" Flashes popped as she posed briefly, her hand resting lightly on her belly. She moved through the crowd with quiet authority, stopping to greet the mayor's wife, then an Arts Foundation director, then Ethan Blackwell himself. When she took her seat at the head table, it was clear to everyone watching, she wasn't just attending, she was hosting. Midway through the luncheon, the MC took the stage. "Today's benefit has been made possible by the generosity of our lead sponsor, Miss Olivia Carter." Applause rippled through the ballroom. And then, almost as if scripted, Matthew walked in. He hadn't been invited, but someone must have tipped him off that Olivia would be here. He was dressed for damage control, navy suit, charming smile dialed to maximum. But the moment he saw her at the head table, the smile froze. She didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge him at first. Instead, she leaned toward Ethan and said something that made him laugh. The kind of easy, familiar laugh that read well in photos. The cameras caught it instantly. Matthew lingered near the back, clearly debating whether to approach. Olivia decided for him. She rose, microphone in hand. "I want to thank everyone for being here today. Your generosity will help us expand arts programs in public schools across the city. It's proof that when you invest in something with integrity, you get real results." Her eyes flicked to Matthew for the briefest moment on the word integrity. The message was clear, even if no one else knew the details. The applause was warm, genuine, and as she stepped down from the stage, the photographers closed in. Matthew was stuck on the sidelines, invisible in a room where he once would have commanded attention. One of the society reporters caught up to her near the exit. "Olivia, any comment on Carter Investments' failed partnership with Hartwell?" She smiled faintly. "Just this. Sometimes the best deals are the ones you don't make." By the time she left the plaza, the narrative was already spinning. Olivia Carter dominates Hartwell vote, blocks ex-husband's deal. From gala drama to boardroom power move, Carter writes her own ending. Matthew had wanted to erase her. Instead, she'd made sure his name now appeared in the same sentence as failed deal and blocked vote. And she had done it without raising her voice, without a single public argument. Just facts, timing, and the kind of composure he could never manufacture. The revenge wasn't loud, but it was permanent. The night after the plaza luncheon, Olivia stood in her apartment, barefoot, holding a cup of chamomile tea. The city stretched out below her, thousands of lights winking against the dark, each one a story, a life, a possibility. She had won, not just the boardroom vote, not just the quiet humiliation of Matthew, but something far greater. Herself. It had been months since the day he told her she'd lost her glow. Months since she'd felt the sting of being dismissed, discarded, and underestimated. She'd walked into that gala unsure if she was still visible in a world that thrived on image and spectacle. Now she knew visibility didn't matter nearly as much as presence, and hers could no longer be ignored. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was Ethan, sending a photo from that afternoon. The two of them laughing at the head table, her hand resting on her belly, the caption simply, "Power looks good on you." She smiled, setting the phone aside. The transformation hadn't been about proving something to Matthew anymore. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped being revenge and started being rebirth. She wasn't just the woman who'd been wronged. She was a businesswoman, a mother-to-be, a strategist who could sit across from some of the most powerful people in the city and hold her ground without flinching. She thought about the girl she had been when she first met Matthew. Fresh out of college, eager to please, convinced that love meant adapting herself to fit someone else's vision. That girl had been willing to shrink so someone else could shine. Never again. The baby kicked softly as if echoing the thought. She whispered into the quiet, "You'll never see me small." The months ahead would bring challenges. She knew that. Matthew wasn't the type to take defeat quietly. he'd likely try to spin his losses to claw back his position. But Olivia had learned the secret he would never grasp. When you stand in your truth, other people's narratives lose their power. In the following weeks, she poured herself into projects that mattered to her. Expanding arts programs, mentoring young women in business, even setting up a fund to help single mothers start their own companies. Invitations flooded in, but she was selective. Every appearance, every meeting, every article was part of a larger picture she was painting for herself and her child. And people noticed. She started receiving letters from women she'd never met. Some had seen her at the gala, others had read about her Hartwell vote. They wrote about divorces, betrayals, and the crushing feeling of starting over. But they also wrote about hope, about how seeing Olivia's quiet, unshakable rise had made them believe they could rise too. One letter stood out. It was from a young woman in Ohio. "I watched them tear you down, and I watched you walk back in like you owned the room. I've been scared to leave someone who doesn't value me. You made me feel less scared. Thank you." Olivia read it twice, tears prickling her eyes. That was it. That was the real victory. It wasn't the applause at the luncheon or the headlines that called her a society phoenix. It was knowing that her story, messy, painful, and imperfect, could be a light for someone else. One evening, she met Ethan for coffee. They sat at a quiet corner table, the city's spring air filtering through the open window. "You've changed," he said simply. "I had to," she replied. "I couldn't stay the woman who needed someone else's approval to feel real." He tilted his head, studying her. "So what's next?" She thought about it. Not the next deal, not the next public appearance. Something deeper. Raising a child who understands that strength isn't about being the loudest. It's about knowing who you are when no one's clapping. Ethan smiled. "Then you've already started." Weeks later, when her baby was born, a healthy, fierce-eyed little girl, Olivia held her close and felt the weight of every step it had taken to get here. She thought of the woman she'd been at the start of this story and the one she was now. The distance between them wasn't measured in months or miles, but in choices. And she knew this. Every woman has a moment when she decides she will not be defined by what she's lost, but by what she will build. For Olivia, that moment had been walking through the doors of the Starlight Gala. For someone else, it might be leaving a toxic job, ending a friendship that drained them, or simply looking in the mirror and choosing themselves. She would tell her daughter that story someday. Not because it was about Matthew, but because it was about her, about the fire that lit the moment she realized she was enough. On a warm evening, months later, she attended another gala. The same chandeliers, the same champagne, the same city glittering beyond the windows. But this time, she wasn't walking in to prove anything. She was there because she belonged. As she crossed the ballroom, someone stopped her. "You know," the woman said, "you're even more beautiful in person." Olivia smiled. "It's not beauty," she said gently. "It's peace." She moved on, her gown whispering across the floor, her head high. Somewhere across the room, she caught a glimpse of Matthew, talking to a small group. He saw her, of course. But for the first time, she felt nothing. No sting, no ache, no shadow of what had been. She'd already won the only battle that mattered. And as she left that night, slipping into the back of a waiting car, she thought of all the women who'd written to her, all the women still out there on the edge of their own moment. Her voice was quiet, but sure as she spoke into the darkness. "Ladies, listen to me. You are never too broken to rebuild, never too small to take up space, and never too late to rise." So the story has ended, my wonderful friends. Are you still here with me right now? If you are, it means something in this journey touched your heart in its own quiet way. Remember, as an old heterodox saying goes, a wound is where the light chooses to enter. No matter who doubted you, left you, or tried to write your ending, you can rewrite it. You can rise again. If this touched you, please like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. Your next chapter is waiting.